Alright everyone, settle in for tonight's exploration. We're veering off the well-trodden path of heroic sagas and stepping into something a touch more unvarnished. Prepare for a deep dive not into the celebrated triumphs of Viking conquerors but into the forgotten toil and the everyday misery of life aboard a 9th-century longship. That glossy version of history you've seen in television shows, all fearsome warriors with magnificent beards sailing off to glorious adventure. Well, the unvarnished truth was often a far cry, and frankly your modern comforts would feel like a distant, unimaginable dream. So, find your coziest spot. If you appreciate a journey into the raw, unfiltered past, a like on the video would be fantastic, and do consider subscribing for more of these historical reality checks. As always, I'm curious to know where you're joining us from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and time. It's always a highlight seeing our global community. Okay, perhaps dim those lights, let a soft ambient sound fill the room, and let's embark on tonight's rather sobering journey together. You are not a king, nor a legendary jarl. You are a farmer, a fisherman, a carpenter. You are a carl, a free man, but your freedom is bound by the seasons and the thin soil of your homeland. The summer is for raiding. Your local chieftain has called for men to join him on a voyage west, to the rich, poorly defended lands of the Angles. He promises silver, glory and a chance to escape the monotony of your life. You, and dozens of others, answer the call. You sharpen your axe, you gather your meager gear, and you say goodbye to your family. You are not an explorer. You are a pirate, a participant in a violent, high-risk business venture, hoping to return with enough plunder to survive the winter. Your vessel is the longship. It is a masterpiece of naval architecture, a thing of terrible beauty. It is long, narrow and shallow, designed for both speed on the open sea and for navigating shallow rivers. But do not mistake it for a comfortable ship. It is in essence a very large, open boat. There is no cabin, no shelter, no below-deck area to escape the elements. You and 60 other men will live, eat, sleep and work completely exposed to the wind, the rain and the relentless sea spray for weeks on end. The ship is a beautiful weapon, but it is a miserable home. The first thing you must contend with is the smell. It is a thick, inescapable miasma. The primary note is the acrid stench of dozens of unwashed men, packed tightly together, their wool and leather clothing perpetually damp. This is layered with the smell of stale food, the sharp tang of bilge water sloshing in the bottom of the boat, the animal smell of the sheep or goats you might have brought for food, and the pervasive, eye-watering odor of the pine tar used to waterproof the hull. And soon, a new sour smell will join this symphony, the unmistakable, stomach-churning stench of vomit. Your personal space is defined by the sea chest you sit on. This chest contains all your worldly possessions for the voyage, a spare tunic, your sleeping skin, a whetstone for your axe, and perhaps a few personal trinkets. You sit on this chest, you eat on this chest, and you try to sleep beside it. There is no privacy. You are shoulder to shoulder with the man next to you. You hear his snores, you smell his breath, you feel his body bump against yours with every roll of the ship. This enforced, inescapable intimacy with a group of rough, anxious men is a psychological trial all its own. When the wind dies, the real work begins. The sail is lowered, and the oars are brought out. You take your place on a rough wooden thwart. The oars are long, heavy and clumsy. Rowing is not a rhythmic, pleasant exercise. It is back-breaking, monotonous, and agonizingly painful. For hours, for days, sometimes you pull on the oar, your muscles screaming, your hands blistering and then bleeding. The only sound is the rhythmic groan of the oarlocks, the splash of the oars, and the barked commands of the chieftain. This is the engine of the longship, and you are its human fuel. Then comes the seasickness. In the turbulent waters of the North Sea, the longship, with its shallow draft, pitches and rolls with a violent, unpredictable motion. Almost everyone gets sick. The first days are a blur of nausea, dizziness, and violent, uncontrollable vomiting. You retch over the side of the boat, your stomach muscles cramping, your body weak and trembling. There is no escape. You are surrounded by the sight, sound, and smell of other men being just as sick as you are. The bottom of the boat becomes a foul slurry of rainwater, seawater, and vomit. You learn to function in a state of perpetual queasiness. The food on this voyage is designed for preservation, not pleasure. The staple is dried fish, usually cod or haddock, which is as tough as leather and intensely salty. You gnaw on it, your teeth aching with the effort. Accompanying this is a hard, flat bread made from rye or barley, which quickly becomes damp and moldy. To drink, you have water stored in leather bags, which soon takes on a foul, leathery taste, or a weak, sour ale that does little to quench your thirst. Your diet is a monotonous, joyless cycle of salt, mold, and stale water. Let's discuss sanitation. There is There is no toilet, no latrine, no designated area for relief. You must clamber to the side of the boat and relieve yourself over the gunwale, directly into the sea. This is a precarious and deeply undignified act, performed in full view of your shipmate. In rough seas, it is a life-threatening maneuver, a slip, a sudden lurch of the ship, and you are plunged into the freezing, unforgiving ocean. Most men choose to relieve themselves only when absolutely necessary, leading to its own set of discomforts and ailments. The cold is your constant, intimate enemy. The North Sea is a frigid expanse, and the wind that sweeps across it is laden with a damp, bone-chilling cold. Your woolen cloak is your only protection, but it is quickly soaked through with sea spray and rain. You are never truly dry. At night, you huddle under a single animal hide, your body shivering uncontrollably, trying to share warmth with the men next to you. Your hands and feet become numb, your joints ache, and the danger of frostbite is very real. The cold saps your strength, your morale, and your will to live. A storm at sea is not a thrilling adventure, it is a primal battle for survival. The sky turns a bruised purple-black, the wind howls like a hungry wolf. The waves grow into mountainous, white-capped monsters that threaten to swamp your small vessel. The ship, which seemed so large in the fjord, now feels like a fragile leaf tossed on a boiling cauldron. You and every other man must work frantically, bailing water with wooden buckets, managing the single sail, fighting to keep the ship's head pointed into the wave. The noise is a deafening roar. The fear is a cold, hard knot in your stomach. Many long ships simply vanish in such storms, their entire crews lost to the deep. Navigation is an art of guesswork and faith. You have no compass, no charts, no modern instrument. Your chieftain navigates by the sun on a clear day, and by the stars at night. He uses the flight of seabirds, the color of the water, and the direction of the swell to guess your position. In the fog or under a perpetually overcast sky, you are truly lost, sailing blind on an empty, featureless ocean. The fear of sailing in the wrong direction, of missing your landfall and starving to death in the open ocean, is a constant, gnawing anxiety. The boredom of the voyage can be as torturous as the physical hardship. When the weather is calm and you are not rowing, there is nothing to do. You stare at the same gray sea, the same gray sky, the same rough-faced companions, day after day. You mend your gear, you sharpen your axe, you tell the same old stories and sing the same old songs until they lose all meaning. The confinement and monotony fray your nerves. Arguments break out over trivial things, a stolen piece of dried fish, a perceived insult. In the cramped confines of the long ship, small tensions can quickly escalate into violent confrontations. The health of your teeth is a major concern. The diet of tough, dried fish and hard bread requires a great deal of chewing, which wears down your teeth at an alarming rate. It is common to see even young men with their teeth worn down to the gums. A broken tooth or a dental abscess is a source of agonizing, untreatable pain. There is no dentist. The only cure is to wait for the tooth to rot and fall out, a process that can take months of misery. The psychological toll of the voyage is immense. You are cut off from your entire world. You are surrounded by danger and discomfort. You live in a state of constant anxiety and physical stress. You watch the featureless horizon for days, and you begin to feel your own insignificance, your own fragility. The sagas speak of heroes who laugh at the storm, but you see the fear in the eyes of the men around you, and you feel it in your own heart. This journey is designed to break a man, body and soul. Your only source of comfort is your sleeping skin, usually a sheepskin or a sealskin hide. At night, when it is your turn to rest, you and your benchmate huddle together under this single skin, trying to create a small pocket of warmth against the biting cold. It is a foul-smelling, greasy and damp thing, but it is the only shelter you have. The quality of your sleep is poor, interrupted by the rolling of the ship, the cold, and the general misery of your surroundings. You wake up feeling as tired as when you lay down. The social structure on the longship is clear. The chieftain is the absolute authority. His word is law. He is usually a man of proven strength and cunning, and you follow him out of a mixture of respect, fear and the hope of plunder. His chosen warriors, the herd, form an elite inner circle. You are part of the general crew. There is a rough equality born of shared misery, but the hierarchy is always present. The best sleeping spots near the stern and the largest shares of plunder are reserved for the chieftain and his chosen men. Let's talk about the water you drink. It is stored in leather bags or wooden caps. It quickly becomes stagnant and slimy, tasting of the container it is held in. It is a precious resource, and it is rationed carefully. You are always thirsty. You dream of the cold, clear water of the streams back home. The foul taste of the ship's water is a constant reminder of your unnatural, displaced existence on the hostile sea. The moment you finally sight land is one of overwhelming relief and joy. After weeks of seeing nothing but water and sky, the faint dark line of a distant coast is the most beautiful thing you have ever seen. A great cheer goes up from the crew. The mood on the ship lifts instantly. The exhaustion and misery are temporarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of anticipation. The journey is almost over. The work is about to begin. This is what you came for. The chance to take something, to prove your worth, to return home a richer. The raid itself is a brutal, violent affair. Your longship, with its shallow draft, allows you to strike deep inland, appearing suddenly from a river to attack a defenseless monastery or village. The attack is swift and merciless. You are not a noble warrior seeking a fair fight. You are part of a mob, your goal to create terror, to overwhelm the defenders, and to seize anything of value: silver, gold, livestock and slaves. The fight is a chaotic screaming whirlwind of axe and shield. You kill without pity because you know that none will be shown to you. The aftermath of a raid is a scene of grim accounting. You gather the plunder on the beach. The chieftain divides the spoils. He takes the largest share for himself. His elite warriors get the next choice. You and the other common crew members get what is left over: a few silver coins, a piece of jewelry, a fine cloak. You look at your meager share, and you weigh it against the weeks of misery you endured to get it. Sometimes it feels worth it. Sometimes it feels like a fool's bargain. The journey home is often more dangerous than the journey out. Your longship is now weighted down with plunder, making it less nimble in the water. You are a tempting target for other raiders, or for local lords who have organized a defense. And you must face the same storms, the same cold, the same hunger on the return voyage. You huddle over your small pile of silver, protecting it with your life, knowing that you must survive the horrors of the sea one more time to enjoy it. Let's consider the slaves you have captured. They are now part of the cargo, huddled in the bottom of the boat, as miserable and terrified as you were on your first voyage. They are property, another form of plunder to be sold in the markets at home. You look at them and you might feel a flicker of pity, or you might feel nothing at all. They are simply another part of the brutal economy of your world. Their suffering is not your concern. Your only concern is your own survival and your own profit. The navigation by seabirds is a fascinating but uncertain science. You know that gannets and gulls stay close to the shore, so their presence is a good sign that land is near. You might even capture a raven, keep it on board and release it, following its flight path in the hope that it will lead you to land. But these are not foolproof methods. Birds can be blown off course. A raven might simply circle and return to the ship. Your life often depends on the instincts of an animal. The construction of the longship is a testament to your people's skill. The overlapping planks, clinker-built, provide a unique combination of strength and flexibility, allowing the hull to bend and twist with the waves rather than breaking. The keel is a single massive piece of oak. The entire ship is held together with iron rivets. It is a marvel of craftsmanship. But as you lie in the bottom of the boat, soaked to the skin and shivering, this architectural genius is of little comfort. It is a perfect machine for ocean travel, but a terrible machine for human habitation. The single large, square sail is a powerful engine when the wind is right. A good following wind can propel your ship at a surprising speed, but managing the sail is a difficult and dangerous task, requiring the coordinated effort of many men. In a sudden squall you must lower the sail quickly to prevent the mast from snapping or the ship from capsizing. The heavy wet wool of the sail is difficult to handle, and a mistake can be fatal. The sail is both your best friend and a potential enemy. The chieftain's role is not just to command, but to inspire. He must be the strongest, the bravest, and the most ruthless of all. He leads from the front in a raid. He must be a skilled navigator and a charismatic leader. He must settle disputes among the crew with a firm hand. His authority is absolute, but it is not inherited. It is earned and must be constantly maintained. If he shows weakness, if his voyages fail to bring plunder, his men will abandon him for a more successful leader. His position is as precarious as the ship he commands. The concept of a clean injury in a raid is a fantasy. Your axe and your opponents are not sterile instruments. They are caked with the dirt and grime of your world. A wound, even a minor one, is almost certain to become infected. There are no antibiotics. The only treatment is to wash the wound with stale ale, or urine, and bind it with a piece of cloth. You watch as a small cut on a man's arm becomes a swollen, foul-smelling, gangrenous mess, leading to a slow, feverish death days later. The psychological impact of killing is a heavy burden. The sagas speak of great warriors who kill hundreds without a thought, but the reality of looking another man in the eye as you kill him with a hand weapon is a brutal, intimate, and often traumatizing experience. You see the fear in his eyes, you feel his warm blood on your hands. You do this to survive, to get the plunder you need, but the act leaves a mark on your soul, a coldness that you will carry with you long after the voyage is over. The long, light summer days of the north are a blessing and a curse. They give you more daylight for travel and for raiding.
but they also mean there is little darkness to hide your approach, and on the open sea, the relentless 24-hour daylight can disrupt your sense of time and your ability to sleep, adding to the general sense of disorientation and exhaustion. The midnight sun is not a beautiful spectacle. It is a disorienting, wearying phenomenon. The ship is a surprisingly quiet place when the wind dies and you are not rowing. The only sounds are the gentle lapping of water against the hull, the creak of the timbers, and the low coughs and mutters of the crew. It is in these quiet moments that the misery of your situation can truly sink in. You are a tiny speck of life in a vast, empty and indifferent universe. The silence is not peaceful. It is a heavy, suffocating blanket of loneliness. Your comrades are a rough and violent lot. They are hard men, forged by a hard life in a hard land. Fights can break out over nothing. A dispute over a game of dice, a stolen ration, a simple insult, all can lead to a bloody brawl with fists and knives. The chieftain must intervene to prevent these fights from threatening the unity and safety of the crew. You learn to be wary, to watch your back, to never show weakness. Your own shipmates can be as dangerous as the sea or the enemy. The sagas, the stories of your ancestors, are your only entertainment and your only history. At night, a skilled storyteller might recount the tales of the great heroes, of their voyages, their battles, their cunning, and their wealth. These stories are a source of inspiration, a reminder of the glory that is possible. But as you listen, huddled in the cold and the damp, you are acutely aware of the vast gulf between the heroic world of the sagas and the miserable reality of your own voyage. The stories are a beautiful lie. What if you fall overboard? In the freezing waters of the North Sea, your chances of survival are almost zero. Your heavy wool clothing becomes waterlogged, dragging you down. The ship is moving too fast to turn around quick. Your comrades might throw you a rope, but in rough seas, they will not risk the ship to save one man. You will watch as your only link to life, your floating home, sails away and disappears over the horizon, leaving you to die alone in the crushing icy cold of the ocean. The concept of personal wealth is tied to things you can carry. Silver arm rings, coins and jewelry are the most prized forms of plunder. They are portable and universally valuable. This is what you risk your life for. The dream that sustains you through the misery of the voyage is the thought of returning to your village, your arms heavy with silver, able to buy more land, more livestock, and the respect of your neighbors. This dream is a powerful motivator, a glittering prize that makes the suffering seem worthwhile. The ship itself requires constant maintenance. The pine tar that waterproofs the hull must be periodically reapplied. The wool sail, your only engine, must be patched and repaired. The rigging, made of walrus hide rope, must be checked for wear. This is tedious, necessary work that fills the long hours at sea. The ship is a demanding master, requiring constant attention to keep it from succumbing to the relentless assault of the sea. The food supplies dwindle as the voyage goes on. The dried fish becomes harder and saltier. The bread becomes a solid mass of green mold. The water becomes almost undrinkable. You begin to suffer from the first signs of malnutrition. Your gums might bleed, a precursor to the deadly sea plague of scurvy. Hunger becomes a dull, constant ache in your stomach. The voyage becomes a race against starvation, a desperate push to reach land before your supplies and your bodies give out completely. The chieftain's authority is symbolized by his high seat at the stern of the ship. From here he steers the vessel with the side rudder, or steerboard, and commands the crew. He is the brain of the ship, and you are its muscle. The physical separation between his position and your rowing bench is a constant reminder of the social order. He is a leader, a man of vision and command. You are a rower, a man of sweat and toil. The camaraderie you feel is a strange and contradictory thing. You might despise the man sitting next to you, but you will row in perfect time with him for hours. You might not trust him, but you will stand back to back with him in a shield wall during a raid. Your lives are bound together by a shared purpose and a shared danger. This is not friendship, it is a pragmatic, desperate, and deeply functional bond, forged in the crucible of the long ship. Let's consider the simple act of trying to stay dry. It is an impossible task. The low sides of the long ship mean that sea spray is constantly washing over the crew. Rain soaks you from above. The bilge water sloshes around your feet. Your woolen cloak, your only protection, is perpetually damp, heavy, and smelly. The feeling of being warm and dry is a forgotten luxury, a distant dream you can barely remember. This constant miserable dampness is one of the most soul-crushing aspects of the voyage. The sagas describe Vikings as fearsome berserkers, warriors who enter a trance-like fury in battle. The reality is more complex. The berserker rage might have been a form of psychological preparation for the terror of combat, perhaps induced by ritual or even hallucinogenic mushrooms. For you, the average raider, the emotion before a fight is not fury. It is a cold, hard knot of fear that you must master. You fight not because you are a monster, but because the alternative is death, or a return home in shame and poverty. The return to your home fjord is a moment of indescribable relief. You see the familiar green hills, the small collection of houses that is your village. You smell the wood smoke from your own hearth. The misery of the sea begins to recede. You have survived. You have returned. You are, for now, a success story. You proudly display your silver, you tell exaggerated stories of your battles, and you conveniently forget the weeks of seasickness, cold, and terror. The myth of the heroic voyage begins the moment you step back on dry land. You look at the faces of the young boys in your village, who look at you with awe. They see your silver arm ring, they hear your stories, and they dream of joining a raid themselves one day. They see the glory, not the cost. They do not see the ghosts of the men who did not return, the friends you lost to the sea, or the sword. You know the truth, but you do not speak it. To do so would be to admit the foolishness, the desperation, the sheer, dumb luck of your own survival. And so the cycle continues. The long ship is pulled ashore for the winter. It is repaired, retarred, and made ready for the next season. It is a symbol of your culture, your identity, your ambition. It is a tool of exploration, of trade, and of brutal, violent plunder. It is a masterpiece of design and a floating engine of misery. It is the vessel that carries your dreams and your nightmares. It is the wooden cage that defines your worth. And as you lie in your own bed, in your own home, the floor solid and unmoving beneath you, the room warm and dry, you can still feel the phantom roll of the ship. You can still taste the salt spray on your lips. You can still hear the roar of the storm, and the groan of the oar. The voyage is over, but it will never truly leave you. It has been burned into your memory, a long and miserable journey in pursuit of a small glittering prize. A journey that proves that the greatest enemy of any Viking was not the Saxon shield wall, but the vast, cold, and utterly indifferent sea.
In the years immediately following the Second World War, the great cities of Europe lay in ruins, their people exhausted by years of conflict and privation. The Grand Alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany had itself fractured, its shared purpose dissolving into a new and bitter ideological struggle. A shadow had fallen across the continent dividing east from west, and nowhere was this division more stark, more tangible or more dangerous than in the shattered heart of the former German Reich, the city of Berlin. The city, like the country, was carved up among the four victorious powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. But Berlin held a unique and precarious position. It was located deep inside the Soviet occupation zone, a geographic island 100 miles from the nearest Western-controlled territory. The western sectors of the city, American, British, and French, thus formed an isolated outpost of democracy and capitalism in a sea of communism. For the 2 million Germans living in West Berlin, their connection to the outside world depended entirely on a handful of designated railway lines, highways and canals that ran through Soviet-controlled territory, their access guaranteed by fragile post-war agreements. By 1948, the wartime cooperation had fully devolved into the tense, suspicious standoff that would become known as the Cold War. The Western powers, seeking to rebuild the shattered German economy and create a stable democratic state, decided to introduce a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, into their occupation zones. For the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, this was both a threat and an opportunity. He saw the creation of a prosperous West Germany as a direct challenge to his control over Eastern Europe. The new currency provided him with the pretext he needed to solve the persistent problem of West Berlin, this irritant, this bone in his throat. He would squeeze the city until the Western powers were forced to abandon it. On June 24, 1948, the squeeze began. Soviet forces halted all rail and road traffic moving between West Germany and West Berlin. They shut down all canal and barge traffic. The power stations in the Soviet sector which supplied most of West Berlin's electricity were shut off. The city was under a total blockade. The calculation was simple and brutal. Without food, without coal for heat and electricity, the 2 million people of West Berlin would soon face starvation and a freezing winter. They would have no choice but to accept Soviet control. Stalin believed he had presented the West with an impossible choice. The leaders in Washington, London, and Paris were caught in a terrible dilemma. Their options were grim. To abandon West Berlin would be a catastrophic humiliation, a signal to the world that America and its allies lacked the will to stand up to Soviet aggression. It would shatter the confidence of every nation living in the shadow of the Soviet Union. But the alternative seemed even more terrifying. To try and force an armored convoy down the highway to Berlin would be seen by the Soviets as an act of war. The risk of a misunderstanding, a single shot fired, leading to a full-blown conflict between nuclear-armed superpowers, was terrifyingly real. It seemed that a third world war could begin on the Autobahn to Berlin. The American military governor in Germany, General Lucius Clay, was a firm and resolute commander. He famously declared, "We have lost Czechoslovakia, Norway is threatened. If we mean to hold Europe against communism, we must not budge." But how to hold on? It was then that a third option, one initially dismissed by most experts as logistically impossible, began to be seriously considered. What if they did not challenge the blockade on the ground? The post-war agreements guaranteed 320-mile-wide air corridors into the city. What if they supplied the city entirely by air? The idea seemed insane. The city of West Berlin needed a bare minimum of 4,500 tons of supplies every single day just to survive: food for its people, coal for its power plants, and for heating homes. To deliver that amount of cargo by air, using the transport planes of the day, seemed like a fantasy. The largest planes available, the American C-47 Skytrains, known affectionately as Goonie birds, could carry only about 3 tons of cargo each. It would require thousands of flights a day, landing and taking off in a relentless, perfectly coordinated stream, in all weather, something that had never been done before. Many seasoned military planners said it was impossible, but faced with a choice between capitulation and war, the impossible became the only viable option. The decision was made. The Berlin airlift began. The Americans code-named their Operation Vittles, a folksy name for a mission of immense geopolitical gravity. The British called theirs Operation Planefare. In the last days of June 1948, the first planes began to fly. The initial effort was a frantic, disorganized scramble. Any available transport plane was pressed into service. The first flights carried little more than a gesture of defiance, their tonnage falling far short of what the city needed. The pilots flew into Tempelhof Airport in the American sector and Gatow Airport in the British sector, navigating the narrow air corridors, constantly harassed by Soviet fighter jets that would buzz them, make mock attack runs, and shine searchlights into their cockpits at night, to try and blind them. But the airlift continued, and it began to grow. The spirit of the operation captured the imagination of the Western world. More planes were brought in from around the globe. The key to turning the airlift from a desperate gamble into a stunning success was the arrival of General William H. Tunner. Tunner was a master of logistics, the man who had run the legendary Hump airlift over the Himalayas to supply China during the Second World War. He was a quiet, demanding genius of efficiency. Tunner took one look at the chaotic operation and began to implement a series of rigid, transformative rules. He created a one-way system, with planes flying in through the southern and central corridors and out through the northern corridor. Each flight was timed to the minute, creating a seamless, constantly moving aerial conveyor belt. He standardized everything from flight altitudes and speeds to landing procedures. He brought in bigger 4-engine C-54 Skymasters, which could carry 10 tons of cargo, more than triple the capacity of the C-47s. On the ground in Berlin, the system was just as ruthless in its efficiency. German ground crews, many of them women, worked with incredible speed, unloading a 10-ton plane in under 30 minutes. Tunner decreed that pilots were not to leave their aircraft. Mobile snack bars on jeeps would drive up to the cockpit to serve them coffee and sandwiches, while the plane was being serviced and refueled. They were back in the air in under an hour. The airlift became a relentless, 24-hour-a-day operation. In the sky above Berlin, a plane was landing or taking off every 90 seconds. The constant drone of their engines became the city's new heartbeat, a sound of hope. The people of West Berlin were the true heroes of the airlift. They endured a long, cold winter with severe rationing. Electricity was only on for a few hours a day. They huddled in their cold apartments, listening to the planes overhead, their resolve unshaken. The Soviets had hoped the blockade would turn the Berliners against the Western Allies, but it had the opposite effect. The sight of the American and British planes flying in day and night, in fog, rain, and snow, forged a powerful and lasting bond of friendship and solidarity. The former enemies had become partners in a common struggle for freedom. It was a struggle that had its moments of simple, profound humanity. One American pilot, Lieutenant Gail Halverson, noticed groups of children standing by the fences of Tempelhof Airport, watching the plane. On an impulse, he told them to watch for him the next day. He would drop some candy for them. He fashioned small parachutes from handkerchiefs, tied them to chocolate bars and gum, and as he flew over the children, he wiggled the wings of his plane, earning him the nickname Uncle Wiggly Wings, and dropped the small treats. His small unauthorized act of kindness became a sensation. Soon other pilots joined in. The story spread back to the United States, and candy companies and school children from across America began sending tons of candy and gum to be dropped for the children of Berlin. Operation Little Vittles, as it became known, was a powerful symbol of the airlift's spirit. It showed that this was not just a military operation, but a human one,
a mission to deliver not just coal and flour but hope. The airlift continued through the winter and into the spring of. The efficiency only increased. The daily tonnage regularly surpassed the minimum required. In a massive one-day effort called the Easter Parade, the airlift delivered nearly 13,000 tons of supplies, a clear demonstration to the Soviets that the West could sustain the city indefinitely. For Stalin, the calculation had changed. The blockade was not working. It had not forced the West out of Berlin. Instead, it had backfired spectacularly. It had turned into a massive propaganda victory for the United States and its allies, showcasing their technological prowess and their commitment to defending freedom. It had solidified Western European unity and directly led to the formation of a new military alliance, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It had turned the German people, their former enemies, into staunch, grateful allies. On May 12, 1949, after 322 days, the Soviet Union quietly lifted the blockade. The roads, rails and canals were reopened. The first British convoy drove down the Autobahn into a jubilant West Berlin, its trucks laden with fresh food. The airlift had won. It had been the first major confrontation of the Cold War, and victory had been achieved without a single shot being fired in anger between the superpowers. It was a victory of logistics, of political will, and of the shared determination of pilots, ground crews and the 2 million citizens of a besieged city. The Berlin airlift saved a city, but it did more than that. It drew a firm line in the sand, demonstrating to a watching world that in the long twilight struggle that was to come, freedom was something worth defending.
Florence, in the autumn of 1966, was a city living in a state of grace. It was the cradle of the Renaissance, a place where the very stones in the streets seemed to whisper the names of Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Botticelli. To walk through Florence was to walk through a living museum. A city whose churches, palaces and public squares housed the greatest concentration of artistic genius the world had ever known. In the Uffizi Gallery hung Botticelli's Primavera and the Birth of Venus. In the Accademia Gallery stood the sublime, impossible perfection of Michelangelo's David. The walls of its churches were adorned with revolutionary frescoes by Giotto and Masaccio. And in the quiet halls of the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale, the National Central Library, rested a priceless patrimony of human thought. Millions of books including ancient manuscripts, illuminated codices and some of the first printed works of the Italian Renaissance. Through the heart of this treasure house flowed the Arno River. For most of the year it was a gentle, picturesque waterway, its graceful arches like the Ponte Vecchio, reflecting in its tranquil surface. But the Florentines had a long and wary relationship with their river. They knew it possessed a darker, more violent nature. Throughout the centuries the Arno had periodically burst its banks, a reminder of the power of nature that lay just beyond the city's serene facade. But no one alive was prepared for what was to come. In the first days of November 1966, the weather turned biblical. A relentless, torrential rain fell over Tuscany for more than 2 days, a deluge of almost unprecedented intensity. The rain saturated the hills and mountains upstream, turning small streams into raging torrents, all feeding into the narrow channel of the Arno. The river began to rise, hour by hour, its calm, olive-green water turning into a churning, muddy brown. Alarms were raised, but the city's authorities were slow to grasp the magnitude of the threat. The dams upstream were overwhelmed. A massive, unstoppable volume of water began to surge down the valley, a great, angry pulse heading directly for the sleeping city of Florence. In the pre-dawn hours of Friday, November 4th, the Arno broke. It was not a gentle overflowing, it was a violent assault. With a deafening roar, a wall of water more than 20 feet high in places burst over the retaining walls and surged into the ancient, narrow street. This was not just water, it was a thick, greasy, viscous tide of mud, sewage and debris, mixed with thousands of tons of heavy heating oil that had burst from the ruptured basement tanks of hotels and apartment buildings. The floodwaters moved with the force of a battering ram, smashing through the heavy wooden doors of churches and palaces that had stood for centuries. It invaded the ground floors of museums and the basements of libraries. The city's electricity failed, plunging Florence into darkness, a darkness filled with the terrifying sound of rushing water and collapsing masonry. People awoke to find the streets transformed into raging rivers. They scrambled to upper floors, watching in horror as cars, shop signs and furniture were swept away by the current. The heart of the city, its artistic soul, was being drowned. The low-lying Piazza Santa Croce, home to the magnificent Church of Santa Croce, became a deep, swirling lake. Inside the church's museum, the water tore one of the most important artworks of the early Renaissance from the wall, Cimabue's magnificent painted crucifix. The colossal wooden cross was battered and submerged for hours in the oily sludge, its painted surface flayed and destroyed. It would become the most iconic victim of the flood, a symbol of the immense cultural tragedy unfolding across the city.
In the Uffizi Gallery, staff watched helplessly as the waters inundated the ground floor, destroying many stored artwork. But the greatest devastation was happening at the National Library, situated right beside the river. The floodwaters smashed into the library's underground storage vaults, submerging over 1/3 of its entire collection. More than 1 million priceless books, including the entire Machiavelli and Palatine collections of rare manuscripts and early printed works, were now buried in a toxic, abrasive soup of mud and oil. For 12 agonizing hours the water continued to rise. Then, as slowly as it came, it began to recede. It left behind a scene of utter, almost post-apocalyptic, devastation. Florence was no longer a city of stone and light, it was a city of mud. A thick, foul-smelling, blackish-brown blanket of sludge, in some places, several feet deep, covered everything. The beautiful piazzas were now stinking swamps. The ground floors of every building were filled with a chaotic ruin of mud-caked furniture and debris. The silence that followed the roar of the water was one of shock and profound grief. As the scale of the destruction became clear, a sense of despair settled over the city. The damage to the artistic heritage was almost incomprehensible. Thousands of paintings, sculptures, and frescoes were damaged. Millions of books were a sodden, swollen mass of paper, their bindings broken, their pages fused together by mud. The fear was not just that these works were damaged, but that they would be lost forever. Water and mud are the enemies of paper, pigment, and plaster. As the waterlogged books and frescoes began to dry, they were at risk of being consumed by mold. The mud on them hardening like cement, the delicate paint on their surfaces flaking away to nothing. It seemed as if the memory of the Renaissance itself might be erased. As news of the disaster spread, a call for help went out to the world, and the world responded in a way that no one could have anticipated. A spontaneous, unorganized, and deeply idealistic migration began. From all over Italy, and then from across Europe and North America, thousands of young people began to arrive in Florence. They were students, artists, and scholars. They came by train, by bus, by car, with no promise of payment, no organized accommodation, and no clear plan. They came for one simple reason: to help. They came to save the art. They became known as the Angeli del Fango, the Mud Angel. These young volunteers, working alongside the Florentine people and a small contingent of soldiers, launched one of the greatest grassroots rescue operations in cultural history. They waded into the freezing, stinking mud that still filled the basements and ground floors of the city's building. They formed long human chains, passing priceless, mud-caked books, hand to hand out of the darkness of the National Library's flooded vaults. The work was exhausting, filthy, and heartbreaking. Each book was a treasure, and each was a sodden, heavy. They worked with a gentle urgency, learning as they went. They set up makeshift washing stations, using hoses to gently rinse the mud and oil from the pages of medieval manuscript. They laid out hundreds of thousands of books on every available dry surface in the city, hoping to slow the process of decay. They interleaved the wet pages with blotting paper, a monumental task. The Mud Angels were not trained conservators, they were an army of amateurs, powered by youthful energy, and a shared belief that the books and paintings of Florence belonged not just to Italy, an inheritance for all of humanity that had to be saved. Their efforts were a beacon of hope in a city shrouded in despair. They brought not only their labor but also a spirit of international solidarity and optimism. In the midst of the Cold War, a time of deep political division, these young people from dozens of different countries worked side by side, united by a common purpose. Their idealism was a powerful antidote to the cynicism of the age. While the Mud Angels provided the crucial manpower for the initial rescue, the long-term salvation of Florence's art required a different kind of hero: the art restorer. The flood of 1966 was a disaster that inadvertently created the modern science of art conservation. Experts from around the world flocked to Florence, bringing their knowledge and inventing new techniques on the spot to deal with an unprecedented crisis. They set up makeshift hospitals for the wounded art. The great orangery of the Boboli Gardens was turned into a laboratory for saving waterlogged panel paintings. Here the ruined Cimabacco crucifix was brought. The restorers faced a heartbreaking puzzle. They painstakingly reattached the microscopic flakes of paint that had survived, but they made the difficult decision to leave the vast areas of loss as they were, a permanent, visible scar, a testament to what the flood had done. They developed new methods for drying saturated wood panels, for consolidating crumbling frescoes, and for dealing with the unique and terrible problem of the heating oil that had seeped into everything. The National Library became a center for book conservation, where techniques for washing, drying, and repairing millions of volumes were pioneered. The knowledge gained in the crucible of Florence would transform the field of art preservation forever. Years passed. The mud was cleared away, the shops reopened, the tourists returned. The city of Florence, scarred but resilient, slowly came back to life. Some treasures were lost forever, their beauty erased by the dark tide of the Arno. But many more were saved, a testament to the remarkable efforts of those who responded to the crisis. The legacy of the 1966 flood is twofold. It is a story of nature's terrifying, destructive power, and a cautionary tale about human vulnerability. But it is also a story of humanity at its very best. It is the story of the Mud Angels, of the thousands of anonymous young people who demonstrated that a shared love for culture and beauty can transcend national borders. They did not just save paintings and books, they saved a piece of our collective soul, reaffirming the idea that the great works of human creativity are a precious inheritance that we all have a duty to protect.
In the 1st century before the Christian era, the Roman Republic was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. Its legions had conquered vast territories, its coffers were filled with the plunder of 100 nations, and its cities were marvels of engineering and law. But this immense edifice of power and wealth rested on a brutal and precarious foundation: the institution of slavery. Millions of men, women, and children, captives of war or victims of piracy, toiled on the vast agricultural estates, in the mines and in the households of the wealthy. They were human property, stripped of all rights, their lives subject to the absolute and often cruel whims of their masters. Nowhere was this commodification of human life more apparent than in the gladiator schools, the ludi, that dotted the Italian peninsula. These were prisons and training grounds, where strong male slaves were bought and sold, their bodies honed into perfect killing machines for the entertainment of the Roman public. In the city of Capua, one of the most notorious of these schools was owned by a man named Lentulus Batiatus, and it was here in the year 73 that a fire of rebellion was kindled by one man. His name was Spartacus. He was not born a slave, but a free man from Thrace, a region known for its fierce warriors. He had likely served as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman army before being captured, perhaps for desertion or rebellion, and sold. His spirit, however, was not broken. He was intelligent, charismatic, and possessed a natural authority that even his captors could not extinguish. Inside the grim walls of the gladiator school, he began to plot. He persuaded some 70 of his fellow gladiators, men from Gaul and Germany as well as his native Thrace, that it was better to risk their lives for freedom than to die for the amusement of their oppressors. Their breakout was an act of desperate ingenuity. Arming themselves with knives and spit stolen from the kitchen, they fought their way past the guards and out into the streets of Capua. They seized a wagon of gladiatorial weapons and armor, and fled the city, making their way to the one place that offered a natural, defensible refuge, the dormant volcano of Mount Vesuvius. The initial Roman response was one of condescending dismissal. They viewed the breakout not as a war, but as a minor outbreak of banditry, a policing matter to be dealt with swiftly. The Senate in Rome dispatched a praetor, a judicial official named Gaius Claudius Glaber, with a hastily assembled militia of about 3,000 men. Glaber did not even bother with a direct assault. He simply marched his troops to the foot of Vesuvius, and blockaded the only known path down the mountain. He believed he had the fugitives trapped. He would wait for hunger and thirst to force them to surrender. It was on the slopes of Vesuvius that Spartacus demonstrated his first flash of military genius. The Romans were guarding the only road, but the other side of the crater was a sheer cliff face, covered in wild vines. Spartacus ordered his men to weave the tough vines into long, sturdy ladders. Under the cover of darkness, the gladiators rappelled down the cliff face, silent and unseen. They circled around the base of the mountain, and fell upon the Roman camp from the rear. Glaber's militia, completely unprepared for an attack, was annihilated. The victory was stunning. The small band of desperate fugitives had defeated a Roman army. They were now armed with captured Roman weapons and armor. More importantly, the news of their incredible success spread like wildfire through the great slave plantations of Campania. Spartacus had proven that Rome was not invincible. For the thousands of slaves toiling in the fields and vineyards, he was now a symbol of hope. They began to flock to his banner. Shepherds, field hands, and runaway slaves of all descriptions made their way to Vesuvius. The small band of 70 gladiators swelled into an army of thousands. It was a chaotic, polyglot mob, a desperate mass of humanity united only by a shared history of servitude, and a burning desire for freedom. With Spartacus were his key lieutenants, fellow gladiators like the Gauls Crixus and Onymau. Their great challenge was now to forge this untrained and undisciplined multitude into an effective fighting force. Rome, shocked by the defeat of Glaber,
sent a second, larger force under another praetor, Publius Varinius. Once again the Romans underestimated their adversary. Spartacus, using his superior knowledge of the terrain and his genius for ambush and surprise, outmaneuvered and defeated Varinius in a series of sharp engagements. The rebel army grew stronger with each victory, capturing more Roman equipment, and crucially the eagle standards of the legions, a source of deep shame for Rome. The servile insurrection was no longer a local disturbance. It had become a full-blown war, the Third Servile War, the most dangerous slave rebellion the Republic had ever faced. By the spring of 72 the Senate in Rome was in a state of panic. They finally acknowledged the gravity of the situation, and dispatched the full force of 2 consular armies, the legions commanded by the 2 consuls for that year. The rebel army had now grown to perhaps 70,000 people. For Spartacus the strategic objective was clear. He knew that he could not defeat the full might of the Roman Republic in Italy forever. His plan was to march his people north, out of the Italian peninsula, and over the Alps. Once across the mountains, this great army of the enslaved could disperse, each group returning to their original homelands in Gaul, Germany and Thrace, to live as free people. But his army was not a unified body, it was a coalition, and it was beginning to fracture. Spartacus the visionary sought freedom, but many of his followers, particularly the large contingent of Gauls and Germans, led by Crixus, craved something else: revenge and plunder. They had suffered terribly at the hands of Roman masters, and they now wished to inflict that same suffering upon the Italian towns and cities. They were not interested in a long march to a distant homeland. They wanted to loot the riches of Italy. The army split. Crixus, with about 30,000 followers, broke away from Spartacus, and began to raid the countryside of southern Italy. This division proved fatal. One of the Roman consular armies cornered Crixus and his force, and in a pitched battle destroyed them. Crixus himself was killed. Spartacus, to honor his fallen comrade, staged a funeral games in the Roman style, forcing 300 Roman prisoners to fight to the death as gladiators, a grim reversal of their former fate. Though weakened by the departure and destruction of Crixus's forces, Spartacus continued his brilliant march north. With astonishing speed and tactical skill, he confronted and defeated the 2 Roman consular armies in separate battles. He then continued his relentless advance towards the Alps, his goal of freedom almost within his grasp. Near the city of Mutina, in the Po Valley, the governor of Cisalpine Gaul assembled another Roman army to block his path. Spartacus met this army and crushed it as well. The way was open. Before him lay the passes of the Alps, the gateway to freedom. He had achieved the impossible. He had defeated 4 separate Roman armies, and had marched the length of Italy. And then, for reasons that historians have debated for 2 millennia, he made a fateful and inexplicable decision. He turned his army around and marched south again, back into the heart of the Italian peninsula. Why did he turn back? Were his followers, flush with victory, unwilling to leave the plunder of Italy behind? Did they believe they were now invincible, that they could march on Rome itself and bring the Republic to its knees? Or did Spartacus believe that crossing the Alps with so many non-combatants in the approaching winter was simply impossible? We will never know for sure. But this decision to turn back from the threshold of freedom would seal their doom. The repeated defeats of its armies had thrown the Roman Senate into a state of utter panic. In this moment of crisis, they turned to one man, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome, a figure of immense ambition and ruthless efficiency. He envied the military glory of his great political rival Pompey the Great, who was away fighting in Spain. The war against Spartacus was his opportunity to achieve the military command and triumph he so desperately craved. The Senate gave Crassus command of 8 legions, a force of over 40,000 disciplined, professional soldiers. He was a brutal and effective commander. When one of his legions broke, and ran in its first engagement with the rebel army, Crassus revived the ancient and terrifying punishment of decimation. He divided the disgraced cohort into groups of 10, and forced each group to draw lot. The man who drew the short straw was then beaten to death by his 9 comrades. With this single brutal act, Crassus restored iron discipline to the Roman army. He had made it clear to his soldiers that they should fear their commander more than they feared the enemy. Crassus relentlessly pursued the slave army southwards. Spartacus marched his people to the very toe of Italy, the peninsula of Bruttium. His plan now was to cross the narrow strait into Sicily, an island with a long history of slave revolts, hoping to reignite the flame of rebellion there.
He made a deal with Cilician pirates to provide ships to ferry his army across. The pirates took his gold, and then betraying him they sailed away, leaving Spartacus and his army trapped. It was then that Crassus constructed his own monument to Roman power. Across the narrowest point of the peninsula, he ordered his legions to build a massive wall and a deep ditch, nearly 40 miles long from sea to sea. He had sealed Spartacus in. As winter set in, the rebel army began to starve. In a final desperate act, Spartacus organized a breakout. On a dark and stormy winter night, they filled a section of the ditch with earth and timber, and fought their way across the Roman fortifications. They were free from the trap, but their army was now weakened, starving, and their spirit was beginning to break. The final battle came in the spring of 71 BC. Spartacus knew there was no more running. The rebel army, its back to the wall, turned to face the legions of Crassus. Before the battle, Spartacus is said to have killed his own horse, declaring that if he was victorious, he would have his pick of the enemy's horses, and if he was defeated he would not need one. He fought on foot, like his men. The battle was a brutal one-sided slaughter. The slaves fought with the courage of despair, but they were no match for the disciplined might of the Roman legions. Spartacus himself fought with legendary bravery, plunging into the heart of the battle, trying to cut his way to Crassus himself. He killed 2 centurions before he was surrounded by Roman soldiers, and cut down. His body was so dismembered in the fighting that it was never definitively identified. The rebellion was crushed, the war was over, but Crassus's vengeance was not. He rounded up 6,000 captured slaves. To make a terrifying example that would be seared into the memory of every slave in the Republic, he had them all crucified. Their crosses lined the Appian Way, the great road from Capua to Rome, for over 100 miles. It was a gruesome silent warning that this was the fate of any who dared to dream of freedom. Spartacus had failed, but his name would not be forgotten. He became a legend, a symbol of the eternal struggle of the oppressed against the oppressor, a ghost who would haunt the Roman imagination and inspire fighters for freedom for 2,000 years to come.
For millennia, it was the greatest geographical mystery on the planet. The Nile River was the cradle of one of the world's most ancient and magnificent civilizations. It was the lifeblood of Egypt, its predictable annual flood bringing the fertile black silt that sustained a kingdom for 3,000 years. The Egyptians worshipped the river as a god, Hapi, but even they did not know from where it came. Its source was a secret, hidden deep in the vast, unexplored interior of the African continent. The Greek historian Herodotus traveled up the river but was forced to turn back. A Roman expedition sent by the Emperor Nero also failed, defeated by the impassable swamps of the sun. The river's origin remained a question that haunted geographers, philosophers, and kings. Where did this mighty river, which flowed for thousands of miles through barren desert, begin its journey? By the middle of the 19th century in Victorian Britain, this ancient puzzle had become a grand obsession. The Royal Geographical Society in London, the epicenter of British exploration, was determined to solve it. It was the last great blank spot on the map of the world, a challenge to an age that prided itself on scientific knowledge and imperial reach. The quest to find the source of the Nile became a siren call for a generation of ambitious, daring, and often deeply flawed explorers. The story of that quest would become a saga of incredible endurance, bitter rivalry, and tragic destiny, centered on the fraught partnership of 2 extraordinary men. The first was Captain Richard Francis Burton. Burton was a true force of nature, a man who seemed to have stepped out of a romantic epic. He was a brilliant and controversial scholar, a gifted linguist who was said to speak nearly 30 languages, and a master of disguise who had famously traveled to the forbidden holy cities of Mecca and Harar. He was an accomplished swordsman, a prolific writer, and a keen observer of culture. He was also cynical, rebellious, and possessed a dark, brooding temperament, a man who chafed against the rigid conventions of Victorian society. The second man was John Hanning Speke. Speke was in many ways Burton's opposite. An officer in the British Indian Army, he was a tall, fair-haired man of quiet determination. He was less of an intellectual than Burton, but he was a superb naturalist and an obsessive hunter. Where Burton was complex and worldly, Speke was more conventional, single-minded, and possessed a cool self-assurance that sometimes bordered on arrogance. They were 2 men of immense ambition, drawn together by a shared desire for fame and discovery. Their first expedition together in 1854 to explore Somalia had ended in disaster. Their camp was attacked by Somali warriors, and both men were severely wounded. Speke was stabbed multiple times and temporarily captured, while Burton took a spear through his face, the point entering one cheek and exiting the other. The experience left them with physical scars, and it sowed the seeds of a deep and lasting mistrust between them. Yet just 2 years later, when the Royal Geographical Society mounted its expedition to find the Great Lakes of Central Africa, it was this unlikely and volatile partnership that was chosen to lead it. Burton was the commander, Speke, his subordinate. In 1857 they set out from the island of Zanzibar, plunging into the East African interior. Their journey was an ordeal of almost unimaginable hardship. They led a massive caravan of over 100 porters, carrying beads, cloth and wire to trade for passage and food. They were tormented by insects, plagued by hostile tribes, and most of all ravaged by the litany of tropical diseases that lurked in the landscape. Malaria, fevers, and festering ulcers were their constant companions. Both men were felled by illness. Burton became so sick he could barely walk and often had to be carried in a litter. Speke suffered a peculiar agony when a beetle crawled into his ear. In his attempts to remove it with a knife he damaged his eardrum, leaving him partially deaf and suffering from vertigo. Their bodies were breaking down and their already strained relationship was deteriorating under the immense pressure. But they pressed on, driven by their ambition. Their goal was to reach a great inland sea, the Sea of Ujiji, which Arab traders had described and which Burton believed was the true source of the Nile. After months of grueling travel they finally reached it. They had become the first Europeans to gaze upon the vast shimmering expanse of Lake Tanganyika. It was a moment of triumph, but it was also a moment of confusion. Burton, the scholar, was inclined to believe this immense lake was the source he sought. But they soon learned from local people that a large river flowed into the lake from the north, not out of it. If a river flowed in, the Nile could not flow out. The theory was in doubt. On the long and difficult journey back towards the coast, while Burton was still incapacitated by illness, Speke heard stories from traders of another, even larger lake that lay to the north. He became obsessed with the idea. He persuaded Burton to allow him to take a small party on a solo side trip to investigate. Burton, too sick to travel himself, reluctantly agreed. It was a journey that would change everything. After several weeks of hard travel, on August 3, 1858, Speke crested a hill and saw before him a sight that took his breath away. It was a body of water so vast that it stretched to the horizon like an ocean. It was, he wrote, a sea of silver. In that instant, without further exploration, without scientific proof, Speke had a flash of pure intuitive conviction. This was it. This was the source of the Nile. He named the Great Lake Victoria, in honor of his queen. When Speke returned to the main camp and told Burton of his discovery and his theory, Burton was dismissive. He derided Speke's conclusion as mere conjecture, a wild guess based on a single viewpoint. The tension between the two men, which had been simmering for years, now reached a boiling point. The journey back to the coast was a silent, bitter affair. They agreed that they would present their findings together to the Royal Geographical Society in London, but Speke, traveling faster, arrived in England first. In a stunning act of betrayal he broke his promise to Burton. He went directly to the president of the society, proclaimed his discovery of Lake Victoria, and confidently declared that he had solved the ancient mystery of the Nile's source. By the time Burton finally arrived back in London, ill and exhausted, he found that Speke had become a national hero. The newspapers were filled with stories of his discovery, and he was already planning a second expedition, funded by the society to prove his theory. A bitter and very public feud erupted between the two men. Burton, with his powerful intellect and sharp pen, attacked Speke relentlessly, pointing out the lack of concrete evidence, and mocking his rival's less scholarly approach. Speke, in turn, defended his claim with a quiet but unshakable certainty. The geographical world was divided. Speke set off on his second expedition in 1860, this time accompanied by a fellow army officer, James Augustus Grant. Their mission was clear: to travel to Lake Victoria, find the point where the Nile flowed out of it, and then follow the river all the way down to Egypt, providing definitive proof. After another long and arduous journey, they succeeded in the first part of their mission. On July 28, 1862, Speke stood at the spot where the great river exited the lake, a powerful cascade of water he named Ripon Falls. He had found the Nile's exit, but he was unable to complete the second part of his quest. Due to tribal wars and the impassable terrain of the Sud swamps, he and Grant were forced to leave the river and travel overland for a significant portion of their journey. They eventually reached a trading post in the southern Sudan, where they were met by another British explorer, Samuel Baker, who was traveling upriver to meet them. Speke sent a famous triumphant telegram back to London: "The Nile is settled." But it was the gap in his journey, the section of the river he had not followed,
left a seed of doubt for his critics, particularly for the ever-vengeful Burton. The feud continued, its bitterness unabated. The scientific community decided to stage a final showdown, a public debate between the two great rivals, to be held at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, in the city of Bath, on September 16. The stage was set for a dramatic intellectual confrontation. The hall was packed with scholars and the public, all eager to witness the final clash between the two famous explorers. Burton was there, ready to dissect Speke's claims, but John Hanning's Speke never arrived. On the afternoon before the debate, while out hunting partridges on a nearby estate, Speke was killed. He died from a single massive wound to the chest from his own shotgun. The official inquest ruled his death a tragic hunting accident, that he had likely stumbled while climbing over a stone wall, causing his gun to discharge. But the timing was so extraordinary and the nature of the wound so severe, that speculation has always lingered. Had the man who had survived years of hardship in Africa, who was facing a public humiliation at the hands of his great rival, decided to take his own life, the great mystery of the Nile was still not entirely solved. The expeditions of Samuel Baker proved the existence of another major lake, Lake Albert, which the Nile flowed through after leaving Lake Victoria. The final pieces of the puzzle would be put in place years later by the journalist and explorer Henry Morton Stanley, who circumnavigated Lake Victoria, proving its immense size, and then traced the river systems, confirming that Speke's great intuitive leap had been essentially correct. Lake Victoria was the vast reservoir, the primary source of the White Nile. The quest for the source of the Nile was a story that spanned millennia, but its final chapter was a deeply human drama. It was a story of incredible courage and endurance, of men who pushed their bodies and minds to the absolute limit. It was also a story of obsession, of a bitter personal rivalry that drove both men to greatness, but also consumed them. And like so much of the history of Victorian exploration, it was a story with a complex legacy. It solved one of the world's last great geographical mysteries, but it also opened the heart of Africa to the ambitions of Europe, paving the way for the colonial era that would follow in the footsteps of its heroes.